You know, every so often in history, you run into one of those moments that doesn't add up. Something that seems backwards, like the guy who does the work doesn't get the credit, gets sidelined, forgotten. And I believe that this is exactly what happened to Ethan Allen. I recently went to visit his homestead in Burlington, and I'm a big fan of Ethan Allen. I was really disappointed when I saw the homestead, and I've been there several times actually, and it's lackluster, underfunded, unappreciated, and undervisited. I don't understand why, but it really makes me wonder why he got sidelined, why he's not discussed more, other than the Ethan Allen furniture store, which probably most people think of when they hear Ethan Allen nowadays. Here's a guy who led one of the earliest and boldest victories in the American Revolution. He did the surprise capture of Fort Ticonderoga in May 1775. This was a momentous victory. The British were caught totally off guard, and the Americans took the fort without firing a single shot. That's amazing. It's big. It gave the revolution some desperately needed momentum. It also gave Congress access to the cannons at the Fort Ticonderoga that would eventually drive the British out of Boston. And yet, when it comes down to official recognition of him by Congress as the leader of the Green Mountain Boys, the Vermont militia that Ethan Allen basically built and led, Congress chose somebody else to be their commander, not Allen, not the guy who just pulled off this enormous win. I don't understand why. They chose Seth Warner, his cousin. He was one of Allen's lieutenants. He was a quieter guy, often described as mature beyond his years. He was a good soldier, no doubt, but he wasn't the face of the Green Mountain Boys. Ethan Allen is synonymous with the Green Mountain Boys. I'm John Genoa, and this is America's Strangest History. I'd really like to know why Ethan Allen got sidelined by Congress after scoring a big win that arguably set the U.S. on the path to victory against the British during the American Revolution. So first, a little background might be helpful. Ethan Allen wasn't your average military man. He wasn't really a military man at all in the traditional sense. His total military training consisted of about 2 weeks of military service with the Connecticut militia. He was called in to march to Fort Henry to provide support because the fort was under attack by French and Indians. And about a week into the march, his regiment was stopped by people fleeing the fort. And they said, hey, listen, forget about it. You might as well go back. It's too late. The fort fell. It was a massacre. It was terrible. Turn around, go back. So after a week of marching, they turned around and marched back. That was his military service. That's his formal training of military service. Doesn't mean he's not a crack shot, doesn't mean he's not a good military commander, but that's his formal training. Ethan Allen was a land defender, a frontiersman, and I might even say a philosopher. He was a kind of proto-rebel in Vermont before the war even started. He'd been leading the Green Mountain Boys in an armed resistance against New York for years. New Hampshire's governor had been selling land in Vermont to people, and they would go up there and they would start their lives. They would rely on this governor's, assertion that this land was his to sell. And they moved up there. Some of them sunk all their savings into it. And then New York, years later, turns around and says, hey, what are you doing over here? This isn't yours to sell. Vermont belongs to us, to New York. And you know what? They were right. According to the charter to the Duke of York, Vermont was included in New York in that land grant. So Vermont did belong to New York. And yes, the land was sold by New Hampshire's governor wrongfully to people. He didn't have the right to sell that land, but he did. And people relied on it to their detriment. And they moved there and they started lives and they lived there. Ethan Allen, he basically spent his time leading a group of vigilantes around Vermont, doing everything they can to thwart New York's attempt to exert their authority in Vermont, okay? He would do things from physically removing New York judges from towns, kicking them out on threat of hanging them if they return. They would escort them to the border with New York and say, don't come back or you're gonna get it. Now, sometimes they would whip New Yorkers. They would sometimes confiscate their stuff when they moved in. They treated New Yorkers poorly. And it was very clear they didn't want New Yorkers in Vermont, okay? And this was due largely in part to the fact that New York clearly was threatening their lives, their livelihood, their lands, their homes. So this is what I believe is part of what factors into why Ethan Allen got sidelined, okay? So, but now after the raid on Fort Ticonderoga, Allen fully expected to be appointed as the official commander of the Green Mountain Boys under the Continental Army. But in July of 1775, his fellow delegates got together in Dorset, Vermont. And when it came time to call a vote, his own men, who worshiped the ground he walked on, chose almost unanimously to elect Seth Warner as the leader of the Green Mountain Boys instead of Ethan Allen. Now, Seth Warner, like I said, was his younger cousin, a quiet, reserved person. He wasn't the person that led the victory in Fort Ticonderoga. That was Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen was a celebrity in his day. So why, with his own men who worshipped him, who followed him to victory at Fort Ticonderoga, why did they turn around and not appoint him as leader of the Green Mountain Boys? I mean, it had a sting. So what happened? I might suggest that the first place to start is Ethan Allen's personality. He was not a subtle person. George Washington once said that there's an original something about him that commands attention. That's George Washington's way of saying, this guy is pretty hard to ignore. He was a man that loved to get into fights, okay? Fisticuffs, that's what this guy did. He was what they refer to as a brawler, and he really was a brawler. But he also did a lot of good for the people in Vermont, and they're not, mutually exclusive. But commanding attention doesn't always mean commanding troops. That's an important distinction, right? Allen was brash, he was outspoken, and to be honest, he was a bit of a loose cannon. He wasn't interested in following orders, he followed his gut. That's how he got Fort Ticonderoga in the first place, by doing something bold and unexpected, something that he felt his gut told him to do. I think that kind of behavior makes people nervous in a structured army type setting, especially one that's trying to be taken seriously by European powers and build an image of professionalism, right? So Washington and others who were trying to turn the Continental Army into a proper, disciplined fighting force. And then we have Ethan Allen. He didn't really fit the mold. He was also kind of a radical, not just politically, but philosophically. In his later book, Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, Allen said, quote, that Jesus Christ was not God is as plain as truth as the sun shines at noontime. He published that in 1784. But he'd actually been saying stuff like that for years. So we can kind of understand why this probably made a lot of enemies at the time. Now, that sounds academic now, right? But at the time, it was radioactive, even among other revolutionaries. It wasn't just heresy, it was dangerous talk for someone looking for a leadership role in a time when church and politics were basically deeply intertwined here. He broke the mold. So that's one aspect, his personality. The other aspect, I believe, is the politics. Allen was already a major thorn in the side of New York, as I've laid out here, leading vigilante groups to thwart their authority in Vermont, escorting judges and repelling posses and sheriffs from trying to evict people from their land. He basically did everything that he could possibly do to make New Yorkers and New York's life a living hell. Okay, and he was very successful at it using guerrilla tactics, guerrilla warfare tactics. He was amazing at it. So the state had been trying to assert their jurisdiction over Vermont for years, okay? And Allen had been fighting against them, quite literally with the Green Mountain Boys. New York had already labeled Allen, a no-goodnik, and they had a warrant out for his arrest, as well as some of his other people, some of the other captains and whatnot for the Green Mountain Boys. They wanted to haul him into court. They wanted to jail him. Now, they said, Revolutionary War, we're going to put that on hold. Okay, we're going to put that on hold. Let us do what we need to do. We'll take care of it at the end of the war, whether that means jailing you or something, but for now, we need to work together, okay? So when the Continental Congress got together and when they made the election, New York delegates were part of that. They looked at the Green Mountain Boys and asked, should we recognize you as a leader of these men? You can bet that there was pressure behind the scenes not to give the nod to Allen, right? New York had significant power. Still does to some degree, right? Now, unlike Allen, Seth Warner was, by contrast, right? He was a safe bet. He was mature. He followed orders. He was predictable. Seth Warner was from the same region, but quieter. He was disciplined. He knew how to get along with other people. He followed orders, like I said. And most importantly, he didn't have a trail of bruised egos and burned bridges behind him like his cousin Ethan Allen. Plus, I guess another big factor is Seth Warner was related to Allen, right? He was his cousin. That's another reason I think people felt comfortable putting him as leader of the Green Mountain Boys. Probably a bigger part of it than many would, care to admit. In an ideal world, everybody would want Ethan Allen to be in charge of the Green Mountain Boys. But this is not an ideal world, okay? There is some reality here. The Continental Army needed reliability, predictability, not fireworks. And that's what Ethan Allen was. He was fireworks. Even the Connecticut governor, Jonathan Trumbull, described Allen as, quote, too bold, too rash, too ungovernable for our purposes. Maybe that's the answer right there. Now, Ethan Allen never formally protested the decision, but in his later writings, he did reflect on it. He said, I have never been ambitious of command, but I should not have refused it had I been offered it in the spirit of the Republic. Now, I want to say that's a pretty classy way of saying I got snubbed, but I'm not bitter. But still, I think it hurt. After being passed over, Allen volunteered for a risky mission to Canada, to Montreal. He got captured. He spent almost 3 years as a prisoner of war in England. Meanwhile, Seth Warner led the Green Mountain Boys in several key battles in the North, but built a solid, if quiet, legacy as a war hero himself. Allen eventually returned to Vermont and became a political figure, especially once Vermont declared itself an independent republic in 1777. He never again held serious military command. I mentioned New York once again. Okay, so keep in mind Vermont existed as an independent republic for 14 years after the conclusion of the American Revolution. Now, why was that? Is it just because they wanted to be an independent republic? The answer is New York. New York used its considerable influence to basically block them from being admitted to the United States because they were butthurt over losing Vermont, which was rightfully theirs. It wasn't until Vermont finally agreed to a settlement in typical New York fashion, and they paid him a sum of money, and bygones were bygones, and Vermont was born. So that's what ended up happening there. I can see that's a big factor here. So here's what I think. Ethan Allen was a fire starter, okay? He was a frontier revolutionary, the kind of man who makes revolutions possible, but not the kind to be trusted to lead them once they get organized. He was loud, he was brave, he was unpredictable. Maybe, just maybe, he was a little too honest. Revolutions, as it turns out, have a funny way of pushing out their wildest voices once the paperwork starts. But what do you think? Was Allen too volatile to be trusted with command? Or was he a victim of politics and caution? Let me know your thoughts. I really am very curious. Leave them in the comments. I would love to know. I'd like to see what people think about Ethan Allen and if they're as much of a fan of him as I am. I would like to see him get more recognition. Anyway, I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on Ethan Allen and why I think he's pretty underappreciated. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please click like if you did and subscribe for more. Till next time, I'm John Genoa, and this is America's Strangest History.